I'm Carol Talley. I'm part of the teaching ministry team at Salem First Christian Church, and here with me this evening are Lori Dyer, our Director of Children's Ministry, and Taylor Lind, our youth pastor, and we're all part of that teaching ministry team, and we're here to do the workshop for our policy, Reducing the Risk of Abuse of Children, Youth, Vulnerable Persons, and Adults. It was 2014 when the policy was first adopted by our church, and it requires that all staff, all leaders in the church, and all volunteers complete the training every 3 years that goes through the policy and acquaints us with that, as well as some best practices related to avoiding or reducing the risk of abuse. And this training will take about 20 minutes or so to go through together. There'll be time to, if you're here this evening, to ask questions as we go along or at the end of the time. If you're doing this online, you may always call the church office and ask for anyone on staff to help with the questions. The other thing that I would like to tell you is that this is a two-part process. First of all, you go through the training, which is what we're going to do right now in just a few minutes. And then also there is a background check. Both of those things, both the training and the background check, are required every 3 years. For some of you, this will be a renewal of your last training and background check, and for others, it'll be the first time through. It's not hard to do, but it does take a little bit of time. Right now, our church is using a company that's called Clear Investigative Advantage, LLC, as the folks who actually complete the reference check, or the background checks, So the most expedient way for you to finish this process with the background check after the training, you'll get an email from the church, and it will have a link for you to go to Clear Investigative Advantage LLC's website, and you can fill out the forms on their website and get that background check done easily. If it's your first time through, we also need a reference page, a set of references that you fill out, and you get that from us, either on the website, or you can get it in paper form here tonight or at the church. It's important that you know the policy, so it'll be important for you to read through that at some point in your leisure. We're going to go through the high points of it tonight, but you'll want a copy. You can download or read it online or get a hard copy, as I mentioned earlier, and you can always call the church office for that. Sometimes people ask us, well, couldn't the training that I took at work or in some other venue, or the background check that I had to do for my license, wouldn't that cover us for this training, and so we wouldn't have to do it again? And the answer, according to our policy, is no, because the purpose of this training is to be familiar with Salem First Christian Church's policy for reducing the risk of abuse. And so to do that, you need the training that's specifically related to our policy. And our policy also requires that our church be responsible for the background check. So that's the reason why it has to be done through us, even though you may have a working situation where you are required to do this, oftentimes annually. So if what I'd like you to do now, whether you're here with me this evening or you're doing this online, is to give some thought to what it means to reduce the risk of abuse. What does abuse mean? What are we talking about when we talk about abuse? And what are some things that would actually help in the reduction of those chances? So I'm going to give you a minute to think about that, and then I'm going to ask if you've got some thoughts related to that. anybody want to venture a thought? What do you recall about the topic of abuse? Or if you've been in this training before, what do you remember from the last time?
I remember there were rules and regulations about how many people took a kid to the bathroom and all of that kind of stuff to make it safe for them to go without having a parent or whatever.
Absolutely, yes. Having other things?
Under 18 and over 70.
Under 18 and over 70 are particular areas of interest, although our policy does cover everybody, everybody at any age, but definitely young people, children, and seniors are at risk along with other vulnerable persons. That's very true. Well, let's get into the policy a little bit and see where we go from there. Think about your role here at church. What do you do on a regular basis? Who are you frequently around? Who do you see? Do you serve? Do you teach? Are you a helper? Do you ever help out with Family Promise when we have guests staying here? Do you hand out snack bags sometimes to our homeless population? Are you in a leadership role? What do you do here that might put you around other people? One of the things that we think about when we're considering the issue of abuse is not only our own role to avoid being an abuser or to avoid being misconstrued as an abuser by others, but it's also important to know signs of abuse that we might see in others. Even if we have no contact with children at all, we might be around adults who change in their behavior in a way that makes us nervous or uncomfortable, and just to be aware of the fact that abuse can be verbal, it can be physical, it can be emotional, as well as sexual. It can be financial. There's all kinds of abuse around which we want some information and knowledge. And so that's why it's important for everybody to have a little bit of training and background around these kinds of things. We want to be aware of any behaviors that we might have, any tendencies to actions that would cause hurt in others, things we say or do. Certainly, that's an important part of reducing the risk of abuse. Similarly, as I mentioned earlier, sometimes we do things very innocently, but the people who walk by and see or hear what we've said or done might misunderstand because they don't have the whole context. And so we want to be aware of the behaviors that we have, the actions that we take, the things that we say that might be misconstrued. So we want to be aware of that. And like I also said earlier, we also want to be aware of signs of abuse that others might show that we may need to report or think more about. Now let's just talk about some best practices. Our policy with regard to working with children kind of covers two things: ratios of children to adults and this overarching 2-adult rule. If you're working in a nursery, in our nursery, for every 4 children there needs to be an adult. So if there's more than 8 children, there needs to be 3 adults. But there always needs to be 2. There should always be 2. That's just a good rule of thumb. Similarly, when you're working with children in the children's department, the ratio is 1 adult for every 6 children. So you want to follow the 2-adult rule again, but if there are more than 12, it would be advisable to have 3 adults according to our policy. The most critical safeguard is that 2-adult rule. And also, wherever you are, working with anybody, young or old, it's always wise to be visible. To be where the door is open, or there are windows in the door, or where the curtains are open in the room, so that it doesn't look like you're closed off with anyone in particular. That's just a good safeguard. When there are youth volunteering to work with children, as very often happens, the 2-adult rule changes a little bit. 1 adult and 2 youth work fine. It's a good policy to have 2 youth when they work together with children, and then you really only need 1 adult. Again, as long as the ratio of adult to children is met. But that works pretty well, and we find that works well here at church. When you're working with youth, you always want 2 adults, and the ratio is 1 to 10. So there should always be 2 adults. That's the preference. And when you have more than 20, you're going to need more than 2. One thing to consider, especially for overnight activities with youth, even if you only have 2 or 3 students, you never want to be in a situation where there's 1 adult and 1 youth together overnight alone. It's just not a good plan, no matter how innocent the activity might be, or it's just not a good idea for anybody concerned, for the youth or the supervising adult. It's just not a good idea. Do you have questions about those best practices, things we talked about? Well, let's move on and cover what to do if you see something or hear something that concerns you. You want to, as long as it's safe, you want to always act immediately. And in most cases, it's a simple thing that's easy to explain, and just simply confront in a polite and respectful way and say, I'm sorry, I thought I heard, or I'm sorry, I thought I saw or observed, and then you explain what you thought you saw the situation to be. And most of the time, that'll clear it up. It'll take care of whatever the problem is, because it was either a misunderstanding, or if someone was a little bit cranky, they'll settle down, and that's all there is to it. However, if you see or hear a situation that is serious enough that you are really concerned there is verbal abuse or physical abuse or sexual abuse going on, or any kind of abuse for that matter, then it's very important that you act immediately and more firmly. The best advice I could give is to step in and say, please step away and let me take over for you. Let me come in and take over for you. And then, as quickly as possible, you want to find a staff member at the church to help you find the supervisor of that, whatever group that is. If it's children, that would be Lori, or Taylor if it's youth, or pastor, and report that incident. It's extremely important that you make that report. And once again, the supervisory staff are Lori for our children's department, and Taylor for our youth, and Dr. Brooks for anyone. Any age is fine, but especially if you happen to see or hear or feel concern about abuse that deals with either vulnerable persons of any age or adults, you would go to him as supervisor. If you are a mandatory reporter, and some of you are, if you work in public schools, for instance, or in medical field, If you're a mandatory reporter, you will of course need to call the authorities yourself. If you're a mandatory reporter, you know that, and you have had the training that tells you how to follow through with that. But please, please, even if you're a mandatory reporter and you report the concern yourself, contact the supervising staff here at the church and let them know exactly what you saw and what you reported, because it's extremely important for our staff to be apprised of those things, so they're not surprised afterwards. So what do you need to report? Well, as clearly and as concisely as possible. You want to explain what you witnessed or what you heard. You want to describe the situation as factually as possible. Now, it's perfectly all right to indicate what you felt or sensed, but try not to move into what your assumptions were. Try to be as factual as possible. Your feelings, your concerns, sometimes are senses, and they're part of the facts for you, but try not to jump to conclusions that may or may not be accurate. In the report that has to go in, either from the supervisor or from you, if you're a mandatory reporter, it includes the name and the age of the alleged victim and the alleged victim's address. If you can get it, that's great. If you can't, probably the church will have it. Another important thing is the date and time of the incident. That's later on. That can be really important, so you want to be specific about what happened. The name of the alleged abuser, and then also make a note of any explanation that's given to you, either by the alleged victim or the alleged abuser. That's important information to add. And you'll need to give your contact information as well. So those are the kinds of things that have to go into a report. Now, our policy does explain the resolution process. First off, if you see something or hear something and you report it to the supervising staff person, in all chances, all likelihood, it's going to be resolved between the staff person and that individual and or the alleged victim. It'll be resolved easily and quickly. That's just been our history. By the grace of God, that's been our history. But if for some reason the alleged victim or their family or the alleged abuser is not satisfied with the way it was resolved with the staff person, then it goes to Dr. Brooks, our senior pastor. And our policy says that if this, for whatever reason, the senior pastor is not able to resolve the issue, then it goes to the teaching ministry team. And that's because the teaching ministry team is charged with not carrying out the policy, but seeing that the policy is carried out. So it goes to them. And then if for some reason that the issue is still just great enough that it hasn't been resolved at that point, at the last resort, it goes to the church board. And they make any final decision about what needs to be done to resolve the issue. So that's the process that's laid out in our policy for resolving any conflicts that come about. There is nothing in our policy, nothing at all, that would suggest that we should never touch one another or that there shouldn't be any contact between people. That's not what this policy is intended to suggest. We want to be a loving environment, a welcoming environment, and hugs are part of that. But it's also extremely important to remember that everyone has a different level of comfort around their space, their personal space. And so it's just wise to be cautious. For instance, if a child or a young person or vulnerable adult or anybody comes up and gives you a hug, feel free to hug them back. That's perfectly fine, because you may assume that your touch is welcome if they have initiated it. It's just a good policy to follow. It's a good way to be sure that your closeness is going to be all right with that other individual. And there's another suggestion that we got in an earlier training that I hadn't thought about before, but it really kind of makes sense. If you happen to be working with little children and you have them on your lap, the recommendation is you have them on one leg, sitting on one leg, as opposed to across your whole lap. And that way, it just avoids any misconceptions that anyone might have if they see that exchange. It's just a good safety way to handle children when they're on your lap. Now, the other thing that's extremely important has to do with confidentiality. If you see something that is of concern to you, or if you see something that you have had to report, once you've told the staff person about it, whether you've reported it to the authorities or just going through the staff person because you're not a mandatory reporter, that's the last time you mention it. Unless you've been called in for some kind of official investigation and there are ensuing questions, you don't say another word. Not to your spouse, not to your best friend whom you know keeps secrets, not to anybody. Sometimes it's hard to hold on to that information, but it is absolutely critical for everyone's sake that those kinds of concerns do not go beyond the supervising staff and the immediate people involved. So be aware of that. And finally, every once in a while, we read in the paper about an abuse situation that has gone public. And it's a shame when that happens, but it does happen. Sometimes people do not feel their issue has been resolved and they go public with it. They tell someone, or somehow or another it gets to the media. If you should ever be called by a media person or anyone outside of the church other than the immediate staff individual with whom you have reported the incident, don't say anything other than you need to talk to our pastor. You need to call the church office. Because sometimes media are very good at asking questions that seem innocent enough until you get into the conversation, and then suddenly you're divulging information that's very private. So it's extremely important to just refer them immediately to the pastor. And our policy does say that if for some reason our senior minister is unavailable or unable to do that, be the public voice of the church, then it goes to the chair of our church board. So this concludes the training module. Be happy to respond to any questions you might have, or if you're viewing this online, feel free to call the church office, the staff. Any one of our ministry staff are well apprised of the policy and can help you and would be glad to do that. I want to thank you for participating. Watch your email. You'll get an email from Salem First Christian Church, and it will have in it a link to Clear Investigative Advantage LLC. If you use that link, it will take you in the most direct way to get your background check completed. Now, if you're new, if this is the first time you've done this, we also need that reference form to be completed, and you need a copy of the policy. So you should call the church office, get a hard copy, or you can get them from the website, download it, or even fill it out on the web page. and get that sent in to us. If you have questions about that, again, I encourage you to give us a call. We'll do whatever we can to help you with that. If you are uncomfortable for whatever reason using the link with Clear Investigative Advantage, you may fill the paperwork out on our website and the church will submit that to Clear Investigative Advantage for you, or you could even fill out a hard copy and we'll do the same. So that's the training. Those are the instructions. Again, if you have questions, feel free to call, and I thank you very much for being here with us today.